this evening's talk is the latest in a series we've been running called, which really, tonight's talk is called Dreams of Order, and it's part of a series that has taken the theme of utopia as a way really of exploring our own society, our dreams of maybe building something better, and looking at the shortcomings of the world that we live in. So we've taken a number of different takes on this idea of utopia and dystopia, and this evening we're going to look particularly at, I guess, what you'd call liberal utopias. And these are sort of very modern assumptions. They're based on very modern assumptions that a more perfect and harmonious order is not only desirable, but is achievable through the expansion of knowledge, technological production and prosperity. And we're going to have three very different examples of liberal utopias, and they have we've taken a kind of historical look at this. So we're going to invite our speakers to speak in a sense chronologically. So I'm going to introduce them now in the order in which they're going to speak, and they'll get started. Starting in the 19th century with Cheryl Hudson, who's to my right here. And Cheryl is a lecturer in the United States political history at the University of Liverpool and a former director of the academic program at the Rothmere American Institute at the University of Oxford. And her research focuses on the history of citizenship and political culture in the US and on the philosophy of history. And she's very widely published, including Why Academic Freedom Matters, published in 2016. And her forthcoming book is titled Citizenship in Chicago, Race Culture and the Remaking of American Identity. And so Cheryl's going to start us off. And after Cheryl has spoken, Mike here on my left, Mike Wilkinson, is going to speak. And he's going to take us into the 20th century. And the mid-20th century, I think, is the starting point. And Mike is a professor of law at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he teaches and researches in the areas of European integration, constitutional theory, and legal philosophy. And he's the author of Authoritarian Liberalism and the Transformation of Modern Europe. And our third speaker, who is sitting at the end here, is Philip Cunliff. And he's going to bring us up to date, really, I think.
I hope so.
Well, we hope so, yeah. And he is an associate professor in international relations at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL. And he's the author of The New 20 Years Crisis, which is a critique of international relations. And he's also the author of Cosmopolitan Dystopia, which is a book that looks at the international intervention and the failure of the West. He also wrote Lenin Lives, Reimagining the Russian Revolution. And Philip co-hosts the popular global politics podcast, Alpha Bunga Bunga, and is co-author of The End of History. And we'll be hearing more about the end of history, I think, as we go along this evening, a lot more about that. So let's start off with you, Cheryl, with the first of our liberal utopias.
Thank you very much, Pauline, and hello to everyone. I want to use my 10 minutes to talk about modern utopian visions of the future, particularly those that were generated in the 19th century in the United States. Ideal communities do not need to be future-oriented. Plato's Atlantis was, for example, a lost world in the distant past. But modern utopias, at least since More, and especially post-Enlightenment, tend to be interested in the future. So from very early in the modern era, many Europeans imagined America as the purest, the biggest, the best utopian experiment itself. In 1689, the liberal philosopher John Locke said, "In the beginning, all the world was America," by which he not only indicated that America still represented a state of nature full of opportunity and open to unconstrained possibility and promise, but that this was by then perhaps something that was closed off for Europe and perhaps for the rest of the world. So European dreams of America as a fresh start are in fact suffused with a critique of what the old world had become. So people often imagine that utopian ideals are the result of kind of an overflowing optimism about the human capacity to change the world. But actually they are necessarily first grounded in a profound criticism of the status quo, of the world as it is. Yet, of course, the newness of America has also defined the nation's optimistic understanding of itself. For much of its history, it possessed a deep faith in progress, an orientation toward the future, a sense of unlimited possibility, and this optimistic outlook, along with its liberal claims to equality and individual freedom, lasted at least until the 1970s, 2 centuries beyond its revolution and its national founding. So in the decades after the revolution and well into the 19th century, there were hundreds of utopian communities that sprang up all across the United States. They were a response to the growth of industrial capitalism, but they were also a testament to the open and the experimental character of 19th century American society, to the many dreamers who dared to ask the question, what could the future look like? And to a handful of visionaries, men like Robert Owen, who brought his utopian ideas from New Lanark in Scotland to found New Harmony in Indiana in 1825, and Charles Fourier, who inspired numerous phalanxes, including the transcendentalist Brook Farm. I think I'm maybe supposed to be moving this on. Okay. There were also a range of more radical and frankly weirder communities, like the perfectionist Anida community, which practiced complex marriage. Fruitlands, where residents rejected all forms of human labour and only ate fruit plucked from their large orchards. That lasted just a few months. And the Neshoba commune, founded in Tennessee in 1825, which was an interracial free love community in the heart of the Deep South. Now, after the Civil War, there were far fewer utopian dreamers and fantastical visions of perfectly planned out communities, partly because, as Frederick Engels explained in 1876, a democratic agent of change had entered the historical stage. With accelerated economic, technological, and political national development, reformers, especially socialist reformers' hopes, were redirected from planned utopian communities to the emergence and the activities of an industrial working class, who were making their own demands for a better future through collective organisations, one of the most prominent organisations being the Knights of Labour. Now, the Knights advanced a vision of a cooperative commonwealth that sought to replace the wage system with one organised around solidarity, self-government, virtue and leisure, and which put workers in control of their own work. The Knights insisted on the moral equality of citizens and the need for autonomy of action in both the political and the economic sphere. And I've got a little map here which shows you all of the local assemblies that the Knights of Labour established in the late 19th century. But it was not only the working class that were joining together. Industrialists too used combinations and monopoly domination and created huge corporations to protect themselves from a rapidly expanding, unpredictable and volatile market economy. Representatives of both capital and labour huddled together to shelter from the exigencies of industrial capitalism. The growing collectivism of both capital and labour and the conflict that arose between them was a social problem that many minds set to work to solve. Now, one of the people trying to solve this problem was the industrialist George Pullman. And in 1880, 3 years after the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, he established his model town. He bought 4,000 acres of land just south of Chicago, and he built factory plant and a model town to house his workers and their families. He hoped that in providing good housing and a pleasant environment for his workforce, the Pullman Palace Car Company could avoid the industrial strife that had befallen other ventures. Recognising that in an age of combination and monopoly, the political economy of laissez-faire had been fatally compromised, Pullman sought an approach that might avoid the combative consequences of modern labour relations. His promotional literature for his town proclaimed proudly that the town of Pullman was a daring social experiment designed to solve the problem of labour-capital conflict upon lines of mutual recognition. So the town of Pullman boasted a range of residences, all provided with gas, water, indoor plumbing, sewerage, and regular garbage disposal. In stark contrast to the slums of nearby Chicago, the town's streets were paved and well lit, and residents also had use of a schoolhouse, a firehouse, a railroad station, stables, a hotel, which housed the town's only licensed bar, parks, playing fields, the arcade, which had a bank and a theatre and a library, the market hall, and a greenstone church, which you can see on the picture here. So much hope was invested in Pullman's model town, solving the many ills of modernity, not least the problem of class conflict. As historian Cheryl Smith notes, the model town offered a way out of the disorder caused by city living and was therefore viewed by many observers as a worthy template for the future, even if the reality of its operation required the acceptance of a kind of paternalism. And for sure, Pullman's town was a paternalistic utopia. It was based on the idea that an employer who takes care of the physical and moral welfare of his workers, elevating and improving the conditions of the working people, also protects the interests of the company. Although he conjured a town of 1,700 homes and an array of public buildings out of an open prairie, his experiment did not replicate or even accommodate the conditions of the frontier that Pullman himself had benefited from, or draw strength from the democratic culture that it had cultivated. Rather, it sought to solve the industrial age social question by giving material benefits to workers in a town run without any form of democratic government or community control. And it was a private enterprise that ultimately reproduced the conflicts of interest in the modern economic sphere on a broader social canvas. So Pullman designed a concrete solution to the problems posed by mass industrial society. It is perhaps difficult for us to see his town as a utopian solution or a utopian idea even, but it did share with other utopias, including in fact the Knights of Labour's utopian vision, a desire to contain the social conflicts of industrial capitalism and to put in their place a system of harmony and of order. Both Pullman and the Knights failed in their plans, in their design. And in fact, Pullman's experiment, which was devised to eradicate class conflict, ironically resulted in the first truly national strike in American history when his workers walked out in 1894 and brought the national rail grid to a standstill. We might conclude that sometimes conflict is necessary for meaningful social change to take place, and that attempts to assuage or to avoid conflict, which seems, I think, built into many utopian visions, can become more of a barrier to than a facilitator of change. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thank you. Okay, Mike.
Take the microphone. Do I need to put my slides up on the...
Yes, the next one along.
Oh, it's just connected, is it?
Going on, yeah.
That's right. Oh, no, that's...
Next one.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. So, the end of history in the last European. So we're moving forward into the 20th century, and it follows on very nicely from what Cheryl was saying, because my utopia, or dream of order, is about the middle of the 20th century, after the Second World War, and what I call this retreat from politics. Now, the title of the talk, The End of History in the Last European, is a riff on Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man. And he presents the end of history as occurring with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the ultimate victory of liberal capitalism. He's since recanted on that thesis, no wonder, since history obviously didn't end. But I do want to say, and I don't want to make the same mistake as Fukuyama, but I do want to say something about the end of history moment at the beginnings of the post-war reconstruction, and my focus is resolutely about Europe. But to understand this new post-war utopia, we have to look at the interwar period and see what it was a reaction to. So it wasn't that after the Second World War there was a total reconstruction based on a Stunde Null, as the Germans say, a 0 hour. In fact, it was very much a reaction to the industrial conflicts that were taking place in the interwar era, and indeed the march of the masses onto the stage of history, as Eric Hobsbawm calls it, because after the First World War in Germany, you had universal suffrage for the first time, you had parties, mass parties representing the working class, the Social Democratic Party, but also the Communist Party in Germany, and you had a genuine fear of the bourgeoisie that mass democracy might move towards something like socialism. This is captured nicely by the figure of Carl Schmitt, the slightly notorious German constitutional scholar who gradually ended up becoming a Nazi, but in the mid-20s was trying to defend a bourgeois Rechtsstaat, a liberal bourgeois order, because he saw that with the emergence of mass democracy, the middle class may be in danger of losing their place in the society. Already in this interwar era, there was an attempt to reconstruct a new liberalism based on this, what I call an authoritarian form, because of its fear of mass democracy, its fear of the growing class conflicts. And neoliberalism, in fact, begins much earlier than most people assume. It doesn't begin with Thatcher and Reagan in the 80s, but in fact begins in the interwar period. This is Walter Lippmann, who was an American philosopher who debated with John Dewey in the interwar period about democracy. Lippmann was very much a managerial elitist, wanting to contain the emerging mass democracy in the US, but got together with a bunch of European liberals, ordo liberals, as the German neoliberals called themselves, as well as the more familiar Austrian neoliberals such as Hayek and von Mises. And they were already thinking in 1938 about how liberalism, economic liberalism, would need to be reconstructed after its interwar collapse. And in the book, Authoritarian Liberalism, I explain how that's a fundamental moment in understanding the post-Second World War utopia. The cover of the book is Paul Clay's Angelus Novus, which was an inspiration for Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history. And Walter Benjamin is interesting because he didn't want to just let the Social Democrats off the hook, as it were. And he pointed out that one of the failures of social democracy in the interwar period was to adopt this sort of view of history as continually moving towards some kind of economistic progress. In other words, gradually the working class would get a better share of the product, and therefore it wasn't so important that they become politicized, and Walter Benjamin wanted to push back on that. Now, after the Second World War, and this is where we get this sort of new utopia, there is a dystopia, obviously, in some sense, but the trend is to move away from politicization of the working class. There is a retreat from politics, a demobilization of the masses. The German Social Democrats in the late 50s abandon Marxism, they abandon even any notion of class struggle. The Euro-communist parties in France and Italy take a little bit longer to sort of de-radicalize, but eventually too they give up the ghost on any sort of revolutionary ambitions. And part of that is this citizens' alienation. Part of that is in this buying into the project of European integration. And the end of ideology, which is a sort of really what Fukuyama's thesis was, that ideology had ended with the victory of liberal capitalism. In fact, Daniel Bell in the 1960s already wrote a book on the end of ideology, the exhaustion of political ideas in the 1950s. This is to some extent German focused, but it's a bigger story. We are afraid of the people. That was there was a sense that because of the way the interwar collapse of liberal democracy had turned out, based on these myths of hyperinflation leading to the collapse of Weimar, of democratic excess leading to the rise of National Socialism. These were all myths that were built up in order to take the masses away from the democratic sphere. And so it's replaced in after the Second World War with technocracy, managerialism, political centrism. Christian democracy plays a strong role in the centre-right in countries like Italy, order liberalism, which I've already mentioned, and European integration. So there's a kind of a consensus that is formed in the post-war era, a consensus that takes really in pretty much the political spectrum from the Christian Democrats right the way to the Euro-communists on the left. There's a sense that Europe is the only way forward. And this is why I say when Fukuyama pronounces the end of history in early 1990s, in fact, that moment in my retelling of this story is the opposite. It's the end of history. Because with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the upscaling at Maastricht of the euro into a monetary union, you also get the beginnings of a reaction, of a pushback. Mostly from the right. So this is Jean-Marie Le Pen, the founder of the French Nationalist Party, the Front National, whose daughter Marine Le Pen, probably familiar with, only recently nearly scraped into the French presidential runoff. And so you have this moment at Maastricht where in some ways there's a continuation of this managerial centrism, particularly in the way that the European Union becomes more and more important. Ruling the void is Peter Meyer's expression for how this creates a hollowing out of Western democracy through the democratic deficits of the EU. But you also start to get a pushback from right-wing nationalism, some pushback from the left, although it's largely the left has largely vacated the sphere of Euroscepticism to the right. Un petit oui, that was the expression that the French gave to the very narrow 51% vote on the Maastricht Treaty in the early 1990s. 51 to 49%. It should have been an obvious sort of clue that things were not quite right with the project of European integration. But the liberal intellectuals tended to move more and more towards presenting a cosmopolitan, in this case Habermas offered a post-national constellation. So you get this increasing divorce from liberal intellectuals away from mass politics, away from the action, as it were. And this, of course, then reaches a crunch point in the Euro crisis conjuncture, as I call it, where you get these series of it's almost like a jigsaw puzzle here, a series of events, personalities. Mario Draghi on the right steps in to save the euro, president of the European Central Bank. Jean-Claude Juncker controversially stating there can be no democratic choice against the treaties, but in some ways that's just a truism of EU law, unless you leave. So we have the next slide, the next picture, which is Varoufakis talking about Brexit. I don't know if I have time to go into that. How many more minutes do I have, by the way? I've only got a couple of slides, so I may be able to get to the end.
Yeah, you're fine for about another 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so we have this moment where there's a lot of contestation, notably in Greece around the Oki referendum, also in the UK, obviously with the Brexit vote to leave. But there's also a tendency among the European elites to try and patch things up. We see here Angela Merkel talking to Viktor Orban, the Hungarian populist leader, as he's usually referred. But these movements against the status quo tend to be incorporated within European settlement, with the exception, or the potential exception, of the Oki referendum in 2015. This is a coup, as it was famously referred to on Twitter. That's Alexis Tsipras, after having mobilized, or potentially the mobilization of the Greek masses to have voted against the memorandum by the Troika, turns around and accepts an even harsher set of conditions. Lapavitsas, one of the few voices of reason in this debate, that wrote a book, The Left Case Against the EU, but it was to no avail. And this, in a sense, is the last part of the story. It brought us up nearly to the present day. A lot of things have happened since Brexit and the Oki referendums. It almost seems like it's a long time ago now, but this was only sort of seven years ago. But is it important to go back to this utopia at this point, the demobilization, as I call it, of the demos, based on an ideological Europeanism? So there was a sense, I think we felt that in the UK as well. There was a sense that any sort of departure from the European dream, from this post-war notion of an order that could only be achieved through the European project, had this very chilling effect on the democratic process. And in the end, and this I suppose is to sort of try and end on an optimistic note, is that the stabilizer, the hegemonic stabilizer, as it's referred to in international relations theory, wasn't Angela Merkel, it wasn't the power of the Germans, it wasn't even the power of Mario Draghi, but it was the reluctance of the Greek leaders, in this case Varoufakis, to actually mobilize the democratic voice. It was ultimately the demobilization of the masses, which brings us back to this post-war era in the 1950s that we're still living with. In other words, to conclude that if we want to break from the status quo, we need not only to think about overturning neoliberalism, which maybe has already kind of passed, but actually go back to thinking about radical democracy, which was last, I think, felt as a force in the interwar period. So I will finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Phil?
Thanks. So I've changed my mind. I'll stand. Thank you to Pauline and the Liverpool Salon for having me back. It's been a few years since I was last speaking in Liverpool. Last time it was, I think, 2018 or 19. It was talking about the various aspects of the Brexit referendum. But it's nice to be back seeing people face to face again. So I'm going to be talking about Cosmopolitan Dystopia, or more specifically, how the effort to evade utopianism, or the effort to evade the dangers of utopianism, ends up or leads to its own types of dystopia. So the lesson, or what's often presented to us and how we often understand it, that the hard lesson of the 20th century is that the effort to build utopia inevitably ends in dystopia. So the exuberant attempt to pursue kind of sweeping social transformation, to wield political and state power to restructure society, to emancipate society, to free the oppressed, to overthrow empires, to overthrow oppression and vested interests, that all of these efforts inevitably lead to torture dungeons, to prison camps, to overweening state power, to sinister leadership cults, to the terror of the secret police, and so on. And so the effort to build utopia leads to dystopia, and that seems, that's often understood to be one of the hard lessons of the 20th century. And what I want to suggest is that equally the effort to evade utopia has also led to its own dystopia as well, and that it's created its own kind of dystopia. And the name that I want to give for that kind of dystopia, that's the result of the effort to avoid the excesses of utopianism, that's what I call cosmopolitan dystopia. So the excesses of utopianism are generally associated both with the great Russian and Chinese revolutions of the 20th century, but also with a whole host of struggles for national independence across the developing world. By the 1970s in particular, many of the formerly colonized countries had become mired in civil war or trapped in authoritarianism, and this was all taken to underscore the same lesson, that the hubristic attempt to free yourself led to all of these kind of untrammeled dangers and terrible costs. And so in response to that, a lesson was drawn that the effort to wield state power was intrinsically dangerous, that politics was intrinsically dangerous, political power, and that you couldn't take the old model of radical change of seizing state power, then wielding state power to reshape society, that was gone, and that new forms of activism and new forms of social transformation had to be found. And so this produced a new kind of model of change, which was more prudent, more restrained, more conservative, more cautious, and associated with a very different set of actors. So in place of political parties and radicalized social movements, you would have the action of NGOs, or you would have the action of international networks of solidarity, and they wouldn't be organized around seizing power, but would organize through civil society. So they would aim to constrain state power, to limit it, to hold it to account from outside the state. They would avoid the risks of taking and wielding political power, and instead try to contain it and shape it from the outside, and to use various mechanisms, legal mechanisms, social mechanisms, economic pressure, and so on, as a way of containing state power and avoiding all the risks associated with it. And so for those of you, if any of you are familiar with political theory, then this model of this particular kind of political vision is most closely associated with a certain set of post-war liberals such as Judith Shklar and Raymond Aron. And I'm not going to talk about their ideas in any great depth, but only that there is a stream of political theory that was built around this idea that the highest that we could aspire to is limiting human suffering, and that aiming for anything more was intrinsically dangerous, if not totalitarian. So the most we could hope for was limiting human suffering and kind of standing off the rough edges of our societies. And so the kind of actors that would become most associated with this vision of this kind of more modest vision of human improvement would be such as Amnesty International or the Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. So the NGO model of political action, of civil society action, I think, is perhaps the best paragon of this particular vision of limited and modest social change based around improving or limiting human suffering rather than systemic transformation in the conditions of human life. And this model, this more cautious and limited model of human improvement, also intersected in the 70s and later in the 80s with ideas of neoliberalism, which have already been mentioned on the panel. And so neoliberalism was very different political and economic understanding, but it came with a suspicion as well, another suspicion of centralized state power. a suspicion of the idea that the state could be used to direct or guide the economy, a suspicion of economic planning, and generally an attempt to contain and limit the exercise of state power in the economy. So there was an overlap and an intersection between the way in which radical activists came to view their goals and also the broader developments in the world associated with the Thatcher and Reagan governments in the West. So they both mutually reinforced each other in their skepticism towards the exercise of state power. And so this also led to a transformation in the understanding generally as these ideas disseminated and became consolidated and gained ground, particularly in the aftermath of the Cold War. It also led to a transformation in the vision of military power as well. So instead of using military power to achieve specific strategic targets, instead military power came to be understood as something more akin to policing. So the constant use of military power, the current discretionary use of military power to contain social disorder. So the way in which we understand policing as something which is kind of there's a constant need for policing, in the same way military power on the global level came to be seen in the same way. That it was something which was needed to contain social disorder at the global level rather than as something which was aimed at particular kind of political goals and strategic goals. And so this was obviously most closely associated with the idea of humanitarian intervention, which became in many ways the paradigmatic understanding for the exercise or the justifiable exercise of military power. So the notion that military power could be used to limit human suffering, and that was what the kind of the best and most judicious use of military power was. Defending the human rights of individuals against the evils of collective political projects, particularly at the state level. And so this notion of using military power to elevate the rights of individuals and to defend individuals in different countries and in different states around the world was the effort to build a cosmopolitan legal order. So a legal order based around individual rights that was higher than the rights that had previously been claimed by states. So a cosmopolitan legal order. And the various ways in which state sovereignty was pulled apart through these various military operations and forms of economic pressure in which both the former radicals of yesteryear, the radicals that once would have been kind of operating in small offices, in back rooms and whatnot, became increasingly central figures in large NGOs that became tremendously influential and powerful and well-funded, global organizations often working in tandem with supranational agencies, the United Nations, but also the global military operations of actors such as NATO and the US itself. And so through this constant exercise of military power, such as no-fly zones, humanitarian aid corridors, the construction of safe havens, the use of economic sanctions, you had the gradual chiseling away and supplanting of state sovereignty as an organizing principle for political order, and in place a more cosmopolitan understanding of political order. And this obviously, or at least if it's not obvious, hopefully the parallels with the Forever War, which was the way people refer to the exercise of American power through the War on Terror, because it was so kind of unconstrained in time and space, the longest war America has ever fought. The ground for this was laid by this idea that the most we can aspire to is limiting human suffering. And this provides the rationale for the constant exercise of military power to contain, to limit human suffering. The best we can aspire to is that particularly kind of modest vision. And it resulted in the Forever War. So that's one of the dystopian conclusions of this effort to evade the hubris of utopianism. But the others are also the implosion of centralized state power in many of the countries that were targeted in various ways through these military operations. And so Cosmopolitan Dystopia, in my account of it at least, it reaches its nadir or its zenith, however you wanted to see it, in the slave markets of Raqqa. So when the Islamic State insurgency was launched in Iraq, there you have a very direct result of the effort to destroy the sovereign state in the Middle East with the result when the Yazidi girls and women were enslaved by the ISIS insurgents and openly, brazenly sold. New slave markets established in Iraqi and Syrian cities. This is very much the end result of a dystopian conclusion to the effort to avoid systemic transformation. So cosmopolitan dystopia can be seen in what happened in Iraq. It can still be seen in permanent civil war in Libya, in the slave markets in Tripoli. It can be seen in the distrust wave of destruction across the Sahel, countries like Central African Republic and Mali. I would also say it can be seen in the way in which Georgia was carved up by Russia. It can be seen in the so-called People's Republics of East Ukraine. And it can be seen in a swathe of humanitarian protectorates that have been left as a result of these chain of military interventions. So the legacy of this effort to evade hubris and to evade systemic political transformation, to evade the excesses and the dangers of utopianism has actually been dystopian in itself. And so this effort to evade the dangers of the 20th century is left in its own wake. It's left this bloody and ruinous legacy. And so that would be my, I think, what the lesson of the late 20th century and the early 21st century tells us. That even in the efforts to avoid the hubris of utopianism, it has carried its own catastrophic risks, and it has also come with a tremendous cost, which are and results that are no less dystopian than those of the 20th century in places such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. And so that's another lesson, I think, that is worth learning, and perhaps also would prompt us to revisit and rethink what we thought we knew about the 20th century and what happened in the 20th century. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Right, thanks very much to all our speakers. How it works in the Liverpool Salon is we ask people in the audience to comment or to ask questions, and we generally throw the floor open immediately after the speakers have finished. And I wonder if there's anyone out there would like to venture an initial comment. We do have someone, a brave man there. That's great. Well, Stephanie, can you take over? And if you'd like to speak, maybe we'll take a few comments initially, and then we'll come back to the speakers. We'll give them a bit of a break. So if you'd like to contribute, we'll start off with that gentleman there.
Yeah, first of all, thanks to all the speakers. I really enjoyed all those, and there was a coherence to the story that we were being told. But there was also a big hole in the middle of it. And the big hole in the middle of it was, and therefore what? To start with the last speaker's point about the efforts to avoid the hubris of an attempt to pursue utopianism, I'd respectfully suggest need unpacking a bit more, because it wasn't some generalized concept of utopianism. It was particular creeds of revolutionary socialism, embodied and then distorted through all the Soviet experiences and the hideous outcomes of the Nazi experiment. But they were driven by a utopian ideal. It was just a slightly nastier version in their one country. So my point is, if we're to go back and challenge the resistance of pursuit of utopianism, that sort of implies we have a model or something that we think would be better than liberal capitalism with all of its shortcomings. Now, I've sought that. I was a revolutionary socialist in my 20s and sort of grew over the years to lose confidence in that as a way to go. And it ended up a sort of moderately optimistic, occasionally dispirited pro-capitalist who just said it's not a great system, but it's better than the alternatives. And unless you've got an alternative, if you want to start with the revolutionary zeal again, that's always gone so badly, horribly wrong. We need a more credible alternative than the one before. So do we have any, even sort of chipping away at the edges? Because I don't know what it is.
Yeah. Jonah, and at the back there, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm probably the old-fashioned sort of Marxist, as Ricky Gervais would say, the boring sort, not the modern sort. And I would agree with the last speaker that thank you very, very much for your all your contributions, and they were really, really interesting. And the first two speakers, the utopias, to my mind, seem to be about capitalism trying to cope with the conflict between the interests of capitalism and the interests of working people. And Phil's contribution was still, the dystopia stuff was still about capitalism trying to make sure that they adapted to a new situation in the world. And to me, that sort of simplifies it an awful lot. And maybe some people might think that's naive, but I think capitalism has only been around for a small part of history. And as Marx said, all societies, apart from the very, very simple, but all societies have had different classes, and amongst that a ruling class that has is in control until it is thrown out. And we still haven't got the solution yet about how we find a better way than what we have. But what we have with capitalism even is far, far from perfect. I mean, we often just sort of ignore or we're told to ignore the extreme poverty that exists in very wealthy capitalist countries, and imagine that capitalism is the answer for everybody when it obviously isn't. So part of, I suppose, the problem is that working people haven't found that way forward, and that's sort of understandable because we keep fighting. Nothing has been given to working people. It's always been fought for. And we're seeing at the moment that people are taking strike action, but perpetual defence never wins. It's sort of understanding that we actually have to take responsibility ourselves. And it's not easy, but figure out how we usurp that, what seems quite strong capitalist enemy. But that has to be done. That's a task that we have to put our minds to, and we have to find a way to do it. And I don't think that's utopian. I think that's about survival, because as the dystopian, there's parts of the world where people have been destroyed in the most horrific way, and capitalism will do that if it helps it still make profit, and that could come here. So we have got to find a way of getting rid of the bastards, am I allowed to say? Finding a way through.
Thanks. And there's thank you, and there's someone at the back.
Hello there, yes. My name's Alex Popkins. I'm a proprietor at the Athenaeum. So I'd like you to answer my question in a forward-looking fashion. So I don't want to hear about the past. I want to hear about the next decade or next few decades. So the first part of the question is, who are the elites, and who are going to be the new and up-and-coming elites? Where does power reside, in your opinion? Companies, we heard about companies in America, we've heard about NGOs, we've heard about the European Union, could even add billionaires, Westminster, Brussels. Where does power reside? And how do you think this will change in the coming years, if you think it will change at all? And the second part of my question is, these current and up-and-coming elites, what inspires them? What ideas are driving them? Does this differ to what's driven them in the last few decades? Who are the next set of visionaries or revolutionaries or technocratic managers?
Do you say there's one more, Pauline?
I'm not sure. Anyone else want to? Yeah, there's a guy there, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Hello, thank you. I've really enjoyed all three speakers today. First of all, Cheryl, I just wanted to ask you a question, if it's okay. About I didn't know about the Pullman village. but it seemed to me like the Port Sunlight village across the way, or the Bourneville village. And I want to know what you thought, whether it was about beneficent patrons of these organisations, or was it pure self-interests? In that Henry Ford paid his workers a lot more than the going rate, but he invested a lot of time in training in them, and he wanted to keep the workers. So was he being beneficent, or was he doing it out of self-interest? Mike, I thought your take on the aspects of mass democracy between the wars was very interesting. I thought your take was good. I mean, the problem I've got with radical democracy is that, you know, the majority of people at gang rape are in favour of it, and you have to protect the rights of the individual as much as what the majority want. And so my thoughts were that America lasted 200 years after the revolution because they did protect the rights of the individual. And you said that you talked about the end of ideology, but surely in today's society we still have huge numbers of socialists, and history repeats itself. To the previous speaker on the front row, looking for an alternative to capitalism, I would simply say that, you know, any time that Marxism has been applied, it's resulted in disaster. But it doesn't stop a steady stream. Maybe we voted for Brexit over here because of our attitudes towards exceptionalism, you know, the old empire. But for me, it's about the rights of the individual versus collectivism. And Philip, can I just say, I've never heard the phrase cosmopolitan dystopia before. Big fan. I'll have to follow that up. We all agree on limiting human suffering. I'll have a look at that later. But how do we limit human suffering? Sometimes the best laid plans go wrong, and policies should be decided not on their intentions, but on their outcome, as Milton Friedman says. Military power to reduce human suffering? Well, it never really worked in Afghanistan, didn't work in Vietnam for the Americans, might work in Ukraine. You could argue that it worked in South Korea for people over there. But it remains to be seen whether we have a forever war. I suspect that we always will, because you know, liberal democracies have freedom of speech, and that is worth defending, and the rights of the individual. And our old Marxist friend, who was the first speaker,
we'll wind up. This is your last point.
Friend.
Your last point, and
last
then we'll
point.
come back.
It is the last point. I would simply say, maybe if you're looking for the ideal solution, look at Ayn Rand.
Right. Okay, listen, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back, then we can go back out again. Cheryl, do you want to start off? I thought there was a number of interesting questions, but the question of whether the motivation of Pullman does intrigue me. And you know, and the idea is it self-interest? What drives this? Is it pure desire to make a better world, a sort of almost religious or spiritual need to improve things, or is the self-interest in there?
I actually think it's both things. So he wanted to help to solve this social problem that existed, which was the emergence of these clashing classes, and you know, that was a barrier to successful production for him, right? So it was good for society, and it was good for him as a profit maker to solve the problem, right? They're not in contradiction to each other. But can I move on to the other questions, or do you want to? Okay. So the first two questions were really kind of, I'll answer those together, because they're really kind of getting at the same thing. And I think, you know, is there a better model? You know, is capitalism just trying to cope? Where's the utopia here? And I think that, you know, what I was trying to get at is that the case for socialism or for any kind of radical social change has to be grounded in the conflict-ridden reality of capitalist social relations, right? You can't just kind of try to suppress them or push them away or anything. You've got to actually confront them and deal with them. And but that is, the ability to do that is historically specific, right? So the period that I'm talking about, there is an agent of change, right? There is a working class movement which is, you know, pushing for change. There are intellectuals and reformers who are working with the working class, who want to create a better society, that want, you know, actually are asking lots of critical questions about the contemporary society, about their current condition. And you have to, that's, I guess the first step is asking those critical questions about your current condition, because if you don't look at the world as it is, you can't really know what's wrong with it or how you want to change it. So that's kind of the first step. And then you have to have the ability to change it. You have to have some agent of change, somebody who's going to make that change happen. And I just think that where we are, if we're going to look more kind of future oriented, where we are and where we're going, in our present moment, there doesn't seem to be an agent, and there doesn't seem to be anybody who is really trying to kind of grapple with, critically, with the current social conditions, you know. So there seems to be a lot of obfuscation and a lot of kind of avoidance of what the real problems are in all of our kind of political and economic discussion. So so I'm not very optimistic, I guess, about the ability to change, but I do think I know where it is, and it is, the answer has got to be in kind of expanding democratic capacity, right? So allowing more people to participate and to have a voice and to have control over their lives and over their futures. So I suppose, you know, George Orwell, who kind of wrote this great dystopian novel, 1984, like his solution, or his kind of his conclusion was, you know, that the hope is with the proles, right? That's what his character says. That's where the hope is, and I think that's still just as true, but they're just not here at the moment.
Yeah, thanks. Would you like to come back on any of the questions? Oh, I'll pass it along.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
I can do the big questions, and probably not very many answers. But I think, you know, Cheryl's completely hit the nail on the head. Expanding democratic capacity, democratic autonomy, political autonomy. So my talk was a lot about history, but, you know, and history isn't gonna provide the answers. But it can, I think, help tell us some lessons. And the lesson that my dive into interwar European history and mid-20th century European history told me is exactly that there is an elite fear of mass democracy. You know, it was constructed in various ways to constrain majoritarianism. I personally, if the question is, well, how do you protect the rights of individuals? That's also through democracy. That's what democracy is about, in part. It's managing that conflict between collective and individual autonomy. And the way to do that is through democratically empowered people. So I don't see there as being, I don't think there being a tension in that sense. But then there's no universal answers either. These questions are going to be answered differently depending on where in the world we are, and we have to take the big theories, but also think about the concrete circumstances and what they throw up and what can be grabbed. The opportunities over the last decade were there. There were a number of opportunities. I mentioned a couple of them. So history throws up these moments when there are cracks in the in the power structures, and the light shines through, and we see it for what it is, and we have to grab those moments. But there's no simple answers, and there's no turning back the clock to ideas which, some of which have proved to be disastrous. But the one I think that we can hold on to, and which my story suggested that we must hold on to, is that story of radical democracy. And so that's where I end up. But that's not to say that it can be rolled out with any great ease. It requires a huge amount of effort on behalf of all of us. So on that note, I will hand over to Phil.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and answer all of the questions, if I may, briefly. They're not in the order in which they were put forward. So in response to the first speaker, the point, so what I offered was a kind of a liberal account of the 20th century, not the one that I subscribe to, but nonetheless one which has it has merit, in some respect. It is certainly like it has. You can understand why people would subscribe to it. It has a power. We understand all the terrible catastrophes of the 20th century. It's one way to understand them, and they do need to be understood. So what I offered was this it's a liberal account of the terrible consequences of efforts to improve the human condition, that the search for systemic solutions has led to these terrible consequences. And like you said, do we have a model? It's always gone terribly wrong. And that's true. But what I've tried to suggest, or what I try to put forward with the idea of cosmopolitan dystopia, is that the effort to be modest has also gone terribly wrong. In places like Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Mali, in Libya, these were meant to be, these weren't meant to be radical transformations. They weren't invading these countries, unlike the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s, they weren't trying to build socialism, and yet it ended up looking very similar to the Soviet occupation and invasion of Afghanistan. In Libya, the goal was very modest. It was simply to defend the rights of the civilians that were being threatened by Colonel Gaddafi's troops in the onslaught on Benghazi. It inevitably became a much larger kind of project of regime change, which has been a disaster. And they achieved. It has to be appreciated, I think, that they left Libya worse off than they found it. They left Iraq worse off than they found it. And that's quite an achievement, because they were already in dire straits before. They were places with terrible problems, but they were nonetheless better than in the aftermath of these interventions. So what I was trying to suggest is that I'm not putting forward some radical model. I'm saying that, we require one of the lessons that I would put forward in contrast to the liberal lesson is one, just a modest one, that we shouldn't be afraid of political power. We shouldn't be afraid of centralized state authority, in the sense at least that we shouldn't, there are good reasons to be suspicious of state power, and states have to be held to account and contained, but we also need to understand, politics and power needs to be wielded, and we need to understand that, I think, and learn that lesson. The hostility to state sovereignty has led to catastrophic consequences. So the attempt to be modest has also gone terribly wrong, and that's what I call cosmopolitan dystopia. So the story that I tried to tell was less about capitalism adapting, though it can be kind of melded with that story, but rather a story of radical disappointment, of left liberal disappointment throughout the 20th century with radical failure. And the way in which they responded was this more modest idea. So don't take over the state, don't wield political power, or if you do, it has to be much more restrained and cautious. And NGOs rather than political parties, no revolution, just improve human rights. So, and that, the result of that, like I say, has also led to its terrible consequences. And then to the last speaker, before I go to the speaker at the back. So I think if you're stuck in the cleft stick or if you let yourself get stuck in the cleft stick of counterposing individualism to collectivism, then it's always going to be, it's a very difficult situation to escape from. And the lesson, or one of the conclusions that I draw, is the effort to precisely to protect human rights in the last 30 years has been a disaster. And so the effort to use military power and to use legal power to defend human rights and to kind of to raise human rights above those of states has been disastrous. And so, because what the consequence has been is to empower supranational authorities, to empower NATO, to empower the European Court of Justice, to empower the WTO at the expense of states. And so if we're to talk in terms of rights, we have to understand them in the context of national political systems. So civil liberties and civic rights, political rights rather than human rights, rights at the national level seem to me to be the way forward, rather than this attempt to defend human rights at the supranational level, at a cosmopolitan level. And if there is to always be a forever war, that seems to me a concession to dystopia, and a terrifying one, that we're always at war. Then we accept the idea, which would be alien, I think, to all of our forebears in the 19th and maybe even in the early 20th century, the idea that war is something we just have to accept as a constant aspect of political life. We have to accept the military-industrial complex. We have to accept the distortion of politics that results from constant war. We have to accept restraints on civil liberties. We have to accept just the sheer kind of bloodiness and destruction of war. It's a terrible concession. And a truly, if forever war is our future, it's a truly dystopian conclusion, and one that I would, wish to resist. Though whether we can resist it, obviously, is still open to question. But again, I want to stress the forever war wasn't the outcome of a radical effort to systemically transform the world. It was the outcome of incremental efforts to alleviate human suffering again and again and again. It was the result of seeing military power as a police power, as something that has to be constantly, recurrently exercised to contain disorder. So we have to be suspicious of modesty, is what I'm saying. We can't be, if we have to be suspicious of hubris and ambition, we also have to be suspicious of modesty and supposed prudence and limit. And then finally, to the speaker at the back as to who the elites and who the visionaries are. The visionaries that we have at the moment seem to me to be deeply creepy. And perhaps that's always true, though, some people would say it is. I'm not sure I would think that. But it seems to me like there are two visions that seem to have wide elite purchase, at least, and popular to some degree as well. So one is, I think, a vision of oligarchic communism. I can't really find any other way to describe it. So it's not the idea of communism understood through working class revolution on the 20th century model, but a kind of communism that's implemented from, agreed at Davos, essentially. And that's, I don't know if people have come across this, but this idea associated with the World Economic Forum of you'll own nothing and be happy. So it was introduced by a fairly low-level Scandinavian minister, and the idea was that, in the future there won't be you won't have personal possessions or property because you'll simply rent everything. Everything will be kind of like an Uber kind of service, essentially. And this was presented as a vision to aspire to. And obviously, it's already become kind of mercilessly mocked and kind of lampooned. But it's a vision. It's a very strange vision. It's kind of a hybrid vision of along the lines that Cheryl was talking about, of the kind of Pullman village. So it borrows from kind of old socialist ideas that you can transcend private property and not be kind of just a consumer. But it's something which is not achieved through a working class revolution or through the socialization of private property, but rather through this capitalist transformation where everything becomes rented, so you're no longer kind of dominated by your possessions. And that seems to me deeply creepy. Not least because it's something which is, like I said, led by an oligarchic elite. And the other one would be a green, it seems very clearly like a green vision of our future. And it has technological utopian aspects on some levels. and deeply dystopian, kind of even primitivist aspects on the other. And the elites that are pushing that tend to be supranational elites that are still kind of oriented at the supranational level. And so where does it belong? You know, when, I don't know if anybody saw the Emily Matlis interview with the opposition leader, Keir Starmer, when he was asked, does he prefer Westminster or Davos, he didn't hesitate to say Davos, right? So he still prefers the kind of cosmopolitan global center where he gets to brush up against the likes of Elon Musk, wealthy Silicon Valley oligarchs and big tech, than the idea of the hard graft of kind of trying to cut deals in back rooms in Westminster of national politics. So the question is whether politics can be renationalized, it seems to me, if we can escape that vision of kind of globalist oligarchic communism, and if we can also escape cosmopolitan dystopia of the last 30 years and reconstruct politics at the national level. And that's the challenge for Democrats and for those who believe in self-government, both at the individual level and at the national level.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Phil. And was a lady that, we're going to take some more comments. That was great, by the way, really interesting. I'm also, underneath all of this, before we go out, is something I always connect with Utopia and utopian vision is an ideal of freedom, that we will be free, not just free from necessity and in living in ideal communities where we don't have to, we're free from fear, we're free from want and necessity, but also that there's an ideal of realizing oneself through something else. And that's sort of at the heart of, I guess, what we're all struggling for when we think about what is the perfect world. It's the vision or the dream that's held up by both capitalism and communism, that we will be free, we'll be emancipated, we will be self-emancipated and so on, and self-governing. And it's the thing that seems the most elusive then, because in all of the thing we seem to have failed to actually grasp is not just freedom from want, which seems incredible given the levels of progress and potential for technology to free us from all sorts of scarcities, but freedom. And you mentioned Rand. It's the neoliberals promised everyone that we would be free. And we seem to be moving closer and closer away from that into a kind of unfreedom, I think, is the dystopian opposite of freedom. I'm going to go out and take some more contributions, please. And that lady there, you had your hand up before, and then that gentleman there, yeah.
Having listened to you all, and it's been really thought-provoking, one of the things that I'm thinking, it seems like it's become more dystopian as time has moved on, and the big elephant in the room is climate change, the climate disaster, because at the end of the day, if we can't maintain the balance, the ecosystems of the planet, we are going to descend into anarchy and war across the whole planet. And there's also the issue of how much is the power within the nation states as opposed to the people who wield the money. When there's corporations out there who have more money than the GDP of small nations, and they're actively lobbying to delay things that will keep the planet whole for their own commercial and economic interests, then how much power do the politicians actually have against lobbying, against that economic power of people like the Musks and the Bezos? And yes, there are philanthropists in that sector like Bill Gates, but then you go back to what is altruism. You know, is there such a thing as a true altruist? Because most people get something, even if it's just the feeling of, the good feeling of being kind. Anyway, I'm rambling, so I'll stop. So
thanks very much.
That's the thing.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. This gentleman there. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Tim Ward. I'm a proprietor here. I think this whole topic is absolutely impossibly complicated. I've spent a lot of time in IT, and anybody who's been in IT knows there's a difference between requirement and solution. And you have to set out what the requirement is, and then you have to try and meet that requirement somehow. It seems to me what we're trying to do here is to have a better something or other for human beings. And we don't seem to have talked very much about human beings. I think human beings are creatures of habit. You go to some leader of the Afghan nation, he doesn't want the best for Afghanistan, he just wants whatever he had last time, whatever that was, which tends to keep women out and all the rest of it for cultural reasons. So we're creatures of habit. We got strange habits. We swarm when we lose confidence in our leaders. So there's been all sorts of examples of this with absolute vast numbers of people out on the streets. In Britain, it's very condign. We have big crowds on the Mall when the Queen dies, or when there's a jubilee, and it's all sort of contained in some sort of way. But these habits and the nature of the human being is part of the requirement, because whatever the solution is for the human beings. Then you have the problem of whatever the solution is, you try it somewhere, like the Paris Commune, and guess what? Somebody else comes along with a big hammer and shuts it down. So another requirement is it's got to survive somehow. I was listening, I thought the nearest we got to anywhere about this was Feynman's thing about, he likes democracy because you get to try it again, whatever it was. You know, the last iteration isn't very good, so we improve it next time. His fanciful idea was that the voters are so intelligent that they look at the last government and go, we can prove it here, here, and here, so we'll improve it by, well, it's not quite as good as that. Churchill said, you should dislike the government, you should see the voters. So, we got that sort of complication. But I do think probably democracy is the best way we can sleepwalk our way forward into something better, because one beacon on this, it seems to me, is that if it's a really good idea, it'll catch on and it will change other people's habits. So but I just think the whole thing is fantastically complicated.
And then Kevin.
I'd just like to speak up for Utopia, because I think we've been calling things utopian that aren't particularly. I think in tonight's discussion, although they all went wrong and some of them were crazy, particularly the fruitopians. I remember laughing out loud in the University of Liverpool Library when I read about them. But we were relatively early in the idea of people getting the freedom from the domination by kings and churches to think of their own lives, to think, what would we actually like? So yeah, some of them thought about railway towns and soap towns, and some of them thought about only eating fruit, and some of them thought about having as many wives as they could think of. But we were trying at quite a local, I know what's going on here level to see if things might work. And some of them, I think, worked a lot better than the stories that have been told about them afterwards. And cumulatively, they might have led to something. You can read, and I have, any sort of number of early 20th century books where some sort of utopianism was assumed to be what was coming. That there was a better way gradually being worked out. If it was a scientific experiment, we were approaching a paradigm change that hadn't yet happened. And then, and it's in tonight's story, then humanity frightened the life out of itself by having 2 world wars, more or less joined together. And since then, we've somehow managed to blame Utopia for them. Utopia was a big idea around late 19th century, early 20th. And it copped the blame for lots of things I don't think were utopian. And our reaction to the failures of fascist Germany and communist USSR has been world reactions, whole economy reactions, the neoliberal, let's do all things one way and let's force, like you said, let's force regime changes on ones that won't go along with things, or bankrupt Greece if it gets a bit naughty. But that's nothing to do with the utopian ideas that were being tried out in the 19th century. So, speaking up for Utopia, is that I think we'd only just got going. And I think, I said the last time I spoke here, I think that Utopia is not a big enough idea to run whole continents. I think utopias need to respond and be based on local situations. And we might even in a country as small as Britain, we might end up with loads of them and have to find out a federated way of them working together if they ever get going. But I think we're all too different and complex in our localities and our cultures to have whole nation, let alone whole continent solutions. But I don't think we gave Utopia a chance. I think it has limitations, but I think we'd only just started. And if we have the odd fruitarians break out again, come on, here's your oranges. So
thanks, Roddy. Thank you. Steph, would you take Kevin over there, right at the back, over there, and then that guy there, and then you.
Thanks. I thought the 3 openings did work very well together. And one of the reasons is that there's a common theme, I think, in terms of political subjectivity and indeed the agent of history. And what I think is perhaps lacking now, and I think it was Philip who said it towards the end, is this idea of democracy and of an agent that can actually carry out some of these political tasks. Because Pullman, like many 19th century capitalists, recognized that they had potential agents on their hands. And from the days of the growth of a working class, mass democracy, leaders as various as Louis Napoleon, Bismarck, William Gladstone, all had this problem: what are we going to do with this mass electorate? And Pullman's was one solution, but the new liberal reforms in Britain slightly later are another attempt. So I think if we look at that as perhaps the harbinger of some of the later crises, because Mike, when you're talking about the 20s and the 30s, you have then the sort of fruition of those fears. And it isn't just the working class. I mean, in Germany, it's going to be the Mittelstand. It's going to be the collapse of one form of order. And so, all of the speakers are talking about an attempt to deal with dissident and challenging forces, political subjects or potential political subjects. So the idea of bringing them into harmony, or trying to contain them, or unleashing them. So if we're thinking about our current period, I think that there are many similarities. States, companies, institutions see the world actually out of control. They see, for example, even in relatively stable European societies, that they have dissident populations. no end of contemporary writers talking about Britain, talking about the sort of the collapse of Britain, the collapse of the state, the failure of the legitimacy of the state. Peter Mayer's Ruling the Void, which I think was 92, 94, is a sort of harbinger of this. So if we're trying to put things together and say what is perhaps new here, is that in the past, ruling groups, politicians, and I think above all economic systems believe that they had the solution. The 20s and 30s threw up Keynesianism, in a sense, New Dealism. It also threw up as a reaction to the problems of democracy von Hayek, which then is reinforced later in the 70s, again in another period of economic and social breakdown. And I think it's sort of sense of breakdown which makes utopianism actually not just utopian, but actually a practical necessity. Because far from the speaker who talks about people being creatures of habit, I actually think we're not creatures of habit. We're actually quite dynamic. That far from us accepting, the status quo, whatever that might be, we're often challenging it. What I think is the problem is the nature of the responses that we do to that. And as citizens or whatever we might be, our job, I think, is to try to develop those alternatives. I think they have to be based around ideas of democracy, and I think that that again goes back into the 19th century. So I think there's nothing wrong with utopianism. I mean, in some ways, the idea of the imagination of imagining a better world, which all the great constitutional documents, whether they be in the English Revolution, which imagines a world turned upside down, or the American Constitution, or the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, are all utopian. And our job is, I think, to put them into practice, because we have, a fairly pervading sense of crisis. The situation that Philip describes in terms of what Morel called the jungle outside of the EU, the jungle created in Libya or along the Sahel by Western interventions. Those are, urgent practical problems, and simply containment and accepting the crisis as permanent is, I think, no solution at all. So it is a case of, in the old slogan, be realistic, demand the impossible. Perhaps be realistic and demand the utopian.
Thanks. Thank you. And then we'll take yours there. The fellow in the yellow. Yeah.
Dystopia, ask an Evertonian. Things aren't good. I've spent half my day doing a quote guy on Twitter before I came here, and he said, it's George GS 203989, a famous speaker. Life after 18 is mad, because unless you win the lottery, all you do for nearly 50 years is go to work 5 days a week until you retire. You then get about good 10 to 15 years of living before you die in the night, and your wife wakes up to see you dead in a puddle of your own. And that's dystopia. But then he's got 780 likes on Twitter. And yeah, that is utopia. I think it reflects back to what you said before about humanity. We can think about grand scales and epic vistas, but if he's gone to bed happy tonight, he's living his utopia. I think sometimes we need to go back and look at what's my utopia, what's yours, and how can we celebrate each of them together.
Thanks. That's great. Thanks. I'll come back and ask thank you, and thanks for all the contributions. And do people want to pick up on any of them in particular, or all of them? Or who wants to go first? Cheryl? Yeah.
Okay. Is this the mic that's working?
Yeah.
So thanks a lot. So I should say something about climate change. It wasn't part of my talk because of the focus, my historical focus, but actually one of the figures that I mentioned right at the beginning, Walter Benjamin, is interesting here, because there was and there still is a debate on the sort of radical left, the Marxists, about what they call technological fetishism, right? This sense that as capitalism gets more and more sophisticated, technology will provide the answers, right? And a version of that was sort of taken up by the social democratic left, and it was disastrous because it was this sort of, this belief that things will just be fine, things will get better. And Benjamin has this wonderful way of putting it. He says, look, sometimes the most radical thing to do is to pull the brake on the moving train. Right? And this phrase now has been sort of picked up by a sort of different group of sort of the technophobes, if you like. You think, actually, we're not just going to, we shouldn't just have faith, blind faith in technology to solve our answers. Maybe we actually need to have a radical rethink about this idea of never-ending accumulation and so on and so forth. So yes, there are different responses here, but I do want to push back on one thing that you said, which is this sense that it's all sort of beyond the power of the political state. It's these massive corporations and what can politics really do? This sort of fatalistic, almost naturalization of the phenomenon. And I want to push back on that in a sense because the same things were said about neoliberalism, right? Back from the now talking about neoliberalism in the more recent last few decades. There's nothing we can do. It's the markets. The markets will decide. But if you look back at it, the reason that the markets were able to decide was through a series of political decisions from elites pushing decisions to supranational organizations, to international institutions, allowing capital to have free reign around the world. So what was taken to be just, this is outside the realms of what we can deal with, is actually outside the realms of what we can deal with because decisions were made to put it there. Right? So I wouldn't want to simply dismiss the sort of the importance of politics simply because these problems seem to be so global, universal, cosmopolitan, whatever. In that sense, I think Phil's right that the political nation state has to be democratized, and that local answers, perhaps more local also in a sense of federating these issues. So I think the local is absolutely essential here, and I go back to thinking about John Dewey, whose radical democracy was very much about local discussions, local publics. Think places like this, right, where people were able to talk through what's going on and maybe just talk about what we thought about in bed last night. But that's part of what's going on. The last thing I want to say is about possible alternatives, and there's something that I think struck me about the 19th century. I think that came through in a number of people's observations. Perhaps utopia got a bad name in the 20th century, but we should go back to some of the interesting ideas of the 19th century, and I think there is something to that. And one of the ideas that came out of the late 19th century German left was this idea of dual power. So the problem with saying local solutions is, but sometimes you need political power as well, right? Because not least those who are in political power may thwart your ambitions, right? So you need what they call a dual power. You need to take seriously the parliamentary process. Representative democracy is going to be absolutely essential to grasp the political power of the state. But that shouldn't be thought of as an alternative to those forms of local power, the extra parliamentary democracy that is absolutely necessary to grow side by side with that. So they shouldn't be thought of as either or. I think for either one to be successful, you need the other. So that's where I would finish on that. But I'll hand over to who wants to go next.
So thank you for the questions. Again, I'm going to try and answer all of them, though perhaps some of them together. So what the gentleman here, what he said in the front about how we terrified ourselves, humanity terrified itself in the 20th century, I think that is itself an answer to some of the concerns or some of the other questions that were raised, because I think that is true. I think the lesson, perhaps the wrong lesson that we took was that the experience of the 20th century has terrified us and left us hesitant and stumbling as a species. And that in itself is in a way its own, that is itself a terrible fate. I mean, if you look, so with the lady here who talked about climate change, I mean, the real implication of climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is that humanity controls the climate. I mean, that's the real kind of implication of it, that humanity has altered geological and natural processes on such a huge scale that we are, in effect, manipulating, not consciously, but manipulating the climate. And instead of wielding that kind of godlike power, we recoil in horror from our own power. And that I think is the dystopian kind of vision that you portrayed. It's the recoil from that power, from the implications of the power, that we control the environment. And so we mesmerize ourselves with this kind of dystopian vision of ecological collapse. And it's an excellent justification for rule. In the aftermath of the 20th century, when all of our utopias and hopes have been trashed, nothing can be offered. And so what's offered instead is, we'll save you from the worst. So we'll save you from human rights abuses, we'll save you from ecological collapse, but you can't expect too much. And I think we should not accept that rule through fear, and we should not accept the blackmail that if you don't do this, then it's all going to end in anarchy and disaster, because that's the condition of rule, it seems to me, at the moment. And we need to fight against those constraints and not allow ourselves to be terrified. And it's a very hard thing. The 20th century was genuinely horrific, and so learning to trust ourselves again collectively as a species is not, is no easy thing. But I think we have to refuse. There's no way, but we have to refuse that blackmail. I think that would be my kind of large conclusion. On the other questions, just 2 points, I suppose, quickly. So what the gentleman said here about Afghanistan and the the kind of the tribal or conservative Islamic outlook being the default, I wouldn't be so quick to assume it. Because that is the result of Afghanistan after 30, 40 years of constant war. The middle classes, the professional engineers, the modernists, those who hoped they could improve Afghanistan through modernization and development, their political projects were defeated or crushed. The cities were decimated and destroyed and laid waste. The villages and the tribes and all the kind of traditional social structures, as well as kind of new forms of power, the drug lords and so on, they were all empowered, and they are the people who run Afghanistan now. Those of you who are in social media may have encountered this. You can see pictures from the 1970s of Afghan women in skirts walking around parks in Kabul without hijab or burqas. And that possibility, that vision of a modern secular Afghanistan, at least in the urban centers, if not the whole country, that was the vision that was snuffed out through 40 years of war, and the Afghans aren't going to get it back anytime soon. So, the potential for a terrible regression is real. But we shouldn't assume that what we see before us is the only way it can be, because it is itself the result of historical processes. And on this point about democracy, I would say it is, certainly it is the solution. But I think, as has been said on the panel by all of us in different ways, it's been constrained. And that is the terrible thing that we've confronted. And it's particularly been constrained by attempts to control state sovereignty. Because without state power, without sovereignty of the state, democracy is meaningless. It's a talking shop. If you don't have decisions and the supreme power to enact them, then it's just, endless kind of conversation, which has its own charms, but it isn't really politically meaningful. So the effort to constrain democracy, and particularly at the national level by limiting state sovereignty, means that democracy has not been able to offer us the answers. And so fighting against those restraints is vital, I think, if we're to find answers. And then finally, to the gentleman here, so I have to say, this is maybe the hardest question, the most challenging. I don't, so I don't think that, the world is in a bad state. No doubt in the 20th century was terrible and so on. And that doesn't mean I think that life can't be, that life doesn't have its pleasures, or that one can't be happy or enjoy life. But I would also be cautious of cozy dystopias, I think. So I don't know if any of you have been following this, but I work in London, but I live in Canterbury. And one thing that the geniuses in the council have cooked up is this idea of restricted traffic zones. And there's other towns that they're rolling it out in. But they're going to they want to limit every district of the city to 15 minutes walking by limiting the amount of times you can use your car to get around the city. And so everything in principle should be within 15 minutes walking, and this is an encouragement to take your bike or to walk or to use public transport rather than to use your car. So clearly designed by people who don't have grandkids, don't have kids, and probably don't have lives either. But this 15-minute kind of city vision for Canterbury and for Oxford and some other places, it is a cozy dystopia. It's very local and comfortable. You've got everything within 15 minutes. You don't have to worry about the outside world. That's all taken care of. Kind of the idea is it'll all be nice and green and everything will be at your doorstep and convenient. And if you take your car too far, you'll get a warning and a fine from the council, and that'll kind of put you back in. And it's a bit like, lockdown. I mean, for many people, that was a cozy dystopia. You sat at home. Many academics, a lot of academics, no matter what they said, they loved lockdown because they got to stay at home in their pajamas. So the Zoom classes, they loved it. It was nice and cozy. The world outside was kind of, hostile and scary, but inside at home it was okay. You could order you had your Amazon and deliveries. Other people did the work of keeping things going, and you enjoyed it at home. So I guess that would be that's an attempt at answering your question. So I think it is possible to have a good life, I think, despite the terrible things, at least in the Western world it is. But we shouldn't settle for cozy dystopias either.
Thanks. Thank you. And Cheryl.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to finish, this is our last go.
I think it is.
So I just want to finish up really talking about utopianism and the future. I'm kind of a fan of utopianism, but I did want to talk. So I'm going to try and cover as many questions as I can in these remarks. But I want to start with Everton. Sorry, because you should think a little bit about what you're wishing for, because I don't know if you know Julian Barnes's book, A History of the World in 10.5 chapters. He talks in that book about this character whose football team, his utopia is, my football team wins the FA Cup every year, right? That's it, and by 20-0 or something, and so this comes true in his utopia, and wow, this is great for the first couple of years, and then it's like, it's okay, this is really good, but it was better when they just won it, or it was better when they actually just lost it, So you don't get to appreciate the good stuff, without the bad stuff. And I think that when we think about so next year in Jerusalem. But that's the point: is that we do have to understand this kind of perfectionism or utopianism that actually sometimes it's better not to get everything that we want, right? And that human suffering, human sadness even, the bad things that happen to us, they can actually enrich our lives, in many different ways, and that to have a full human experience, you can't go without any of the bad stuff. You want to minimize it for sure, but it's like seasons of the year or whatever. I mean, I don't want to get too silly and philosophical, but that's I think we have to kind of keep that measure. But then we look back at the utopian period, like the communities that were established in the 19th century in America that I was talking about, and they are very diverse, and they do represent a kind of a willingness to experiment, to be free. I mean, a lot of them were kind of playing around with things like free love and, like, you know, freedom to act in any way that you want to kind of throw off the shackles of, like, the bourgeois family or work, you know, like just eat your fruit. And you can see what the appeal of that was if you kind of see that freedom is a good thing and you can see the future. But what they did have in them, and that's what I was trying to emphasize, is that they had a sense of the future, that they wanted to create a better world for the future. And I think that's really necessary for, you know, for human existence, really, to have the future. But I want to tell you, I mean, I do think that history in the past can teach us a lot, and I'm a historian, right? Otherwise I wouldn't think that. I wouldn't be a historian if I didn't think that history couldn't help us to understand our world and to help improve the future. In fact, E.H. Carr, who's a great philosopher of history, he said that every good historian has the future in their bones, right? So it's like you're looking at the past to try to kind of forge a future. But there's another philosopher of history that I've just recently read, and it's a book that you might be interested in looking at, because I really think that it helps to understand our world. It's a book by Francois Hartog, and he wrote a book called The Regimes of Historicity. And his kind of schema is that before the Enlightenment, the human, you know, people, or a kind of regime of our temporal regime, was about looking to the past. With all our reference points were in the past. So I mentioned, for example, Plato's Atlantis. His utopia is in the past, right? That's where he's kind of imagining the good stuff happened. And then after the Enlightenment, the future is the place that we're oriented towards. And America is like the kind of symbol, or the, you know, emblem of that. It's like very future oriented. The good stuff is in the future. It's kind of just out of reach if we could just, you know, go a little bit faster or further. But Hartog says that it's around the 1980s that we again have a shift in this regime of historicity, and that we start to kind of focus in on the present, and that so then everything becomes the never-ending present, and the past disappears and the future disappears, so we end up with just this never-ending now. This is what he says, right? So without, like, if we want to have a utopia, we need a future, and when the future has kind of been shrunk into the present and the past has been shrunk into the present, it's really difficult to kind of have that kind of temporal scope or understanding of the world. So when we're missing a future, how can we have a utopia? And we kind of look at, when I was trying to think, what are today's utopias? What are the dreams of the future? I actually came up with a lot of the same examples that Phil's just mentioned. So these, like, the low traffic neighbourhoods, or I used to live in Oxford, and I've got a lot of friends there, and they're talking about, like, this scheme where if you use your car to go out of your neighbourhood more than 20 times a year, you are charged for it. So they want to kind of contain you in this neighbourhood, and this is somehow a good progressive thing to do. Like, it's very restraining. It's very kind of it's denying the future, if you like, and it's denying freedom. So it become these kind of dreams of order become, as Kevin was saying, you know, very authoritarian in their nature. The more they try to stop us moving forward, having any kind of progress. COVID, again, was another example. That kind of communitarian nature around COVID is like, we're all looking after each other in this little bubble, and it's all so much better than individualism, because there's this virus trying to get us all, like, that somehow we're all sheltering in fear from this virus, spun as a kind of positive, progressive thing, that we're all taking care of each other. And then again, the green kind of environmental approach, which is really about not the future, but about a fear of the future and trying to avoid the future and not trying to take control of the future. So I really think that the end of utopianism means the death of the future But I'm not sure. It might be that the death of the future means the end of utopianism, and that we need to bring back some sense of the future and having a future before we can have any kind of utopian experiments or dreams or thinking. And really, that's why I'm a historian, because I want to bring back the future.
Thanks very much. Thank you. And that made me think that perhaps it's not the end of history or the end of history, but the end of utopianism, or is it the beginning of the end, or something? And that was great. Thank you so much to our three speakers, and thank you for coming to Liverpool, you two, who've come a long way. So a big round of applause for the speakers, please. Thanks for coming. Thank you. And to you for some great questions. And we have another Liverpool salon on Utopia for a change. We're just going to do Utopia again and again until it's revived. So we could be in for the long haul. And the next one is on the 2nd of March in here again, and it's called Practical Utopias. And it's kind of developed some of the things you were talking about, Cheryl, because we're looking at ports on light. We're also going to talk about the Chartists, so big democratic theme, and their national land programme. And Kevin is one of the speakers. He's going to talk about the Chartists. And we have from the Chartist national land programme to Ports on Light. So that should be a really interesting one. And we'll be advertising that soon and sending you information on it. But make a note of it, Thursday, the 2nd of March in here. So thank you again for coming, and there's some drinks downstairs at the bar if you want to order a drink and hang out in here for a bit, and we'll see you down there. Thank you again. Thanks.